y'all who followed Salt Typhoon and the security breaches earlier this year, that was extremely extensive and really disrupted a lot of our major traditional telecommunication companies. We have two leading experts who can talk about cybersecurity and the different issues from a broad background. So I'm going to let Richard, you introduce yourself. Milo, I don't know if you need an introduction, but introduce yourself and your background, what you're doing now, and then talk about cybersecurity and national security and the issues ahead of us. And I really appreciate y'all waiting till 5 o'clock for this conversation.
So Richard Harknett, I am representing the Portman Center for Policy Solutions, which is based at the University of Cincinnati. I was former scholar in residence at U.S. Cyber Command and been playing around with national cybersecurity strategy for a while. And I didn't realize that I was going to color coordinate my socks with the actual stage that we're on, but I think I should get something for that. I don't know, Chip, whether I get something for that, but.
Okay. Green means it's on. I'm Milo Medin. I'm founder and CEO of Logos Space Services. We're building a enterprise-focused low Earth orbit constellation, providing closed user group MPLS connectivity. So think of it like a wireline network in the sky. Before then, I spent 11 years at Google, starting the Google Fiber program, as well as working on our CBRS efforts. And I had the pleasure of serving on the Defense Innovation Board with Eric Schmidt. So I got to spend 5 years dealing with the Department of Defense. Before then, I was the founder of a company called At Home Network, which did most of the cable modem deployments in the US, and that was a lot of fun. And then I did 10 years at NASA before that. So it's great to be here.
Sure, I'll go ahead and jump in. So Paula Boyd, I am currently with Microsoft. I do government affairs, telecom policy work for them, and have had a history in this space, law firm to FCC to Hill to Microsoft. And so that's a little bit of my journey.
Hi, folks. I'm Grace Coe. I'm at Sienna. Many of you may not know the name, but it is a company that does optical networking equipment. So anyone who needs to move a lot of data really far distances really fast knows who we are. We're not a consumer-facing group. But you'll probably hear a little bit more about what we do. I joined Sienna about 1.5 years ago, but have been knocking around the telecom policy space for quite some time. Worked with a number of you in different capacities, both in government and without.
Okay, and last, possibly least, but a privilege to be least amongst such an esteemed group of panelists. Alex Botting, I'm with Venable, which is a law firm headquartered in DC. I work on a range of policy and legal issues at the intersection of technology, telecoms, and national security. One of them being subsea cable security, which is what we're going to talk about in this panel. So to kick things off, subsea cable infrastructure has been in the news a fair bit of late, I think it's fair to say, particularly following incidents that have taken place in the Baltic Sea, the South China Sea, and so on. What is behind that? Are we seeing kind of a fundamental shift that is going on in terms of the security profile of this space, or is it just something that resonates a little bit more because of the general geopolitical tensions which are rising at the moment? Do you want to jump in?
Yep.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. So it's really hard to say whether there is an uptick in actual malicious intent, actions, actual sabotage. Let's just call it that. So the International Committee for the Protection of Cables typically tracks this data. They track how many cable cuts happen every year. And they estimate about 150 to 200 cable cuts occurring every year The majority of them are caused by simple things like shipping accidents or fishing accidents, anchor drops, etc. Another, say 25% are caused by things like natural disasters, erosion, very, very not, the point of that, however, is that the ICPC has never really had a category for intentional deliberate damage. They just don't. So they've never looked for it in the past. All right. And so if you're not looking for it, you're not going to find it. But I think there is something to the fact that that this is a heightened period of geopolitical tensions. And in particular, the Baltics, who are particularly wary of their former or current enemy to the east, are particularly worried that there may be gray aggression, acts of gray aggression occurring undersea, where critical infrastructure can be targeted. The trick is, though, and the question really is, how do you end up sort of beginning to figure out whether that's true or not?
So I'll go ahead and jump in from there. The way I think about this issue a little bit is just to think about the evolution of the telecom network. I think a lot of us can remember when it was circuit switching to digital, switching to broadband, switching to wireless, and then with wireless, switching to the cloud. And when you're in the world of the cloud, it means that you have data centers throughout the globe. And when you have data centers throughout the globe, there's a lot of traffic moving in and out of those data centers, which means that you need additional telecom infrastructure, including subsea cables. I say that to say that we're just moving a lot more traffic, which means that you need more subsea cables than you would have needed prior to that. I think CSIS had a quote that said a bank in a given day moved $3.9 trillion of traffic across subsea cables in a given day. And I think when you have more subsea cables, I think it's an increasing, ultimately, Grace mentioned this, that, you have damage to those subsea cables. When you have more subsea cables, there's probably more damage to those cables just because of numbers generally. There is the question of whether or not that damage is intentional or not intentional. I'll leave that to others to discern. I can't give you the answer there, but I think it's a recognition of the change in the infrastructure and the increasing importance of subsea cables as part of the larger infrastructure. So there's probably more understanding of the role of subsea cables, and there's probably a greater appreciation for the importance of keeping them up and running and connected.
So building off of that, I'll broaden it just not from cables, but strategic communication overall, right? Because we have this concern over salt typhoon in our telecoms and things of that nature. So I thought I would quote, if you'd allow Alex, from a Central Intelligence Agency report about an adversary's capability in this area, because I think this gets to your geopolitical capability thing, if you'll indulge me. So in looking at this adversary's capability, CIA has concluded that this could affect complete disruption of intercontinental point-to-point and long-distance mobile communication. Right? And when thinking about that capability, the report says there's three things that we should be concerned about, the United States. One is the importance of this capability in time of war cannot be overestimated, quote. Right? So the geopolitical condition of war, if that's not on the table, we tend to think about these threats differently than if we actually are in an environment in which geopolitics might tend towards that kind of conflict. The other two elements in this report, which were interesting, they said that this capability enables the adversary to potentially start to break down existing agreements on international communication system by not following the rules, right? And by breaking that down, they may slowly replace the system dictated by monopolies that they control, rather than ones that the United States controls, which the United States was in the lead on. And then the third, that this capability is actually giving them an ability to protect their domestic system for potential segmentation of their domestic population. So for better internal control. So it gives them a war capability, gives them a way of reversing the international communication system, and it also facilitates domestic control, right? So it's geopolitics and capability to disrupt. It's a combination of those two things. The only thing about this is that this CIA report was written 74 years ago. All right? It was about the Soviet Union's ability to jam high-frequency radio signals, right? And it scared the living heck out of the Truman and Eisenhower administration. And one of the reasons why we get the diversification and investment on different forms of telecom and communication tech was because the Soviets were jamming VOA, and we realized if they could do that, they could do a lot more damage. My point in doing this exercise with you is that, in part, we've been here before. We've been in geopolitical competition with a pretty big adversary, and they've had big capabilities to disrupt what we're doing. And so I just set that a little bit of context to hand it over to Milo.
Yeah, I would just say just a couple things. First off, part of the reason people don't have a category for intentional disruption is if you flag something as an act by a nation state actor to disrupt a cable, well, doesn't that require a response? So in the spirit of don't ask questions you don't want the answers to, we don't have a category for that. But that doesn't mean that those things aren't happening. The second is, over the last, I would say, 20 years, the subsea cable infrastructure has really changed, right? Like it used to be run by telcos. Now the bulk of the new cables going in the water are led by the hyperscalers, Google, Meta, among the leaders, but also Microsoft and others. And if you want to see how that transition has happened, I would direct you to some of the North American Network Operator Group meeting archives. You can go to nanog.org and search for talks by folks from telegeographies, and they'll tell you about these changes. And what does that mean, right? Well, the networks that Google uses to interconnect its data centers and interconnect itself to the rest of the network, they're private networks. Like they're not designed to be used by others. It's designed to be used by Google to deliver its services or Meta to deliver its services. And where telcos might cooperate in terms of being able to back each other up or seek capacity, those kind of arrangements really aren't really exercised. Now, Google does have a Cloud Connect product where you could get 100 gigabit transport between two of its POPs, but it's not really meant for this kind of use, right? So I do think that one of the questions is if the bulk of the cable capacity is now private, how can that be leveraged in the case of outages or emergencies? Because we should be thinking about these kind of things and to deal with these kind of problems.
I think that's absolutely right. And look, reasonable minds can differ on the extent to which sabotage is taking place today, ranging from minimal to zero through to actually quite a lot of these incidents have been sabotage. We haven't been had the tools maybe to investigate and prove that. regardless, I think, your point about the rising geopolitical tensions does focus the mind on what should we be doing, regardless of whether it's happening today, to make sure that we do have sufficient resiliency and security and redundancy in the ecosystem. So I wonder if folks can speak to that. What is, for this particular ecosystem, what does resiliency look like? What kind of redundancy needs should we have in place to meet a potentially rising geopolitical risk? Don't be shy, folks.
Sure, I'll go ahead and start. When we think about resiliency, we think about putting together a network that which is diverse. By diverse, I mean, maybe not having all your cables on the Pacific or the Atlantic coast depart the US at the same point. Kind of the notion that you don't have, you're trying to reduce or eliminate sort of single points of failure. So from that perspective, when we think about resiliency, we think about having just, multiple networks, being able to maybe leverage capacity in, on other, move our traffic on other networks if we need to. And another piece of this too, right, is making sure that when we're deploying networks, we have a regulatory structure that allows us to deploy quickly. The process from sort of pulling together sort of the consortium, if that's the path you go, to paying for that network, to deploying that network, is a pretty long process. And there are a lot of things that implicate when you can deploy and how quickly you can deploy beyond the regulatory challenges. But being able to move through the regulatory process, I think, is also another big piece of it. Another big piece of it, I think, from our perspective as well, is having a structure in place that allows for repairs of cables to be done quickly. I think folks have seen, have probably seen articles around, indicating concern around the lack of repair ships. Trying to wrestle that challenge to the ground and making sure that there's enough infrastructure out there and a good enough process and enough resources that those things can happen quickly.
I want to double down quickly on that point because, just a sort of data point here. In certain instances, it's taking up to 6 years to secure the approvals to lay a new cable. Now, obviously, there is some time in that process when you're putting together the plan for it and sourcing vendors and things like that. And there's important national security considerations. 6 years is an awfully long time to be laying new cables. And I feel like there's got to be some efficiencies to be gained there.
I totally agree.
I don't think 6 years is the norm, right? That's sort of the exception. I do think, you look at Korea, almost all the traffic goes through cables that come in Busan, and they're easily cut in a relatively simple way. And it's hard to get traffic there unless you're coming from the Chinese side or maybe go through there are certain limits that you have from the physics of the cables. I think the large number of cables could result in resiliency. Certainly, when the Fukushima quake happened, a bunch of cables in Japan failed. But there were, I was at Google and there was enough capacity in Google's transport that was still up to carry all of Japan if it was needed. But those arrangements, as I said, are not typically made. And I don't think there's the thoughtfulness about that. And if you were, you would have more margin in the cable repair ships as well, because we don't have lots of cable repair ships because we don't have that many breaks. But if somebody were to cut a bunch of cables all at once, it would be a very long time before they're all fixed.
Yeah, I think the interesting thing is that when you look at this system, it was built primarily post World War II when we get the ATT,
Yeah.
right? And it was in this environment which the United States was sort of setting the rules for international commerce, free trade, things of this nature. And we were able to sort of hold the Soviets off and sort of think about global war from a deterrence standpoint, right? Geography really matters with cables. They're not geopolitically laid when you think about this from a strategic standpoint, right? So from a competition standpoint, we've built a system that's just fine, right? And we can build 21st century innovation off of them. But if we're understanding this as a strategic communications network in a geopolitical environment where competition could tip to militarized crisis, say a little island off a large coast of a big country, right? Then this system's a much more vulnerable, and therefore the dependencies that we have, right, not only become a resiliency issue, they become a vulnerability issue. So when you look at the ships that are out there, they're flagged by your geopolitical competitor primarily. The other element to the shipping piece is that these are really skilled crews. Like you just don't take them off merchant marines or just regular sailors and throw them out and say, hey, go repair those cables, right? So there's actually both the shipping and the crews to do that shipping, neither which we have any real resiliency in.
I think one of the big differences, though, is in the post-war era to now, is that the government used to be the dominant consumer of these communications assets. Now commercial is. Whereas the government may have been thinking about hardening and what would happen if cables were cut and had let's just say friendly relationships with carriers. That's no longer the case because government's a relatively small consumer of these cables and their data. And so that level of cooperation that was natural when you had your biggest customer wanting to do certain things with you, worrying about things, that's not really the case anymore.
Thanks. And it should be, right? I mean, it really should be. I think that's one of the things that we, in a previous conversation, had spoken about is, as I think you put it, Richard, aligning commercial and government interests on these particular issues. Mainly, and it is not as though the commercial sector isn't thinking about the security of this critical infrastructure. They are certainly. Paula would not want to have to go and fix all the undersea cables because they were laid poorly for Microsoft. I mean, it just. I'm sure the planners for those networks are always thinking about how to make sure that they're redundant, how to make sure they're resilient, and how to make sure that they're routed appropriately across the seabed. However, I think that there needs to be some understanding from the government's perspective in particular about the business models that drive the deployment of subsea cables, the work that it takes to actually plan the subsea cable, and provide, I think, inputs as they go along and plan. Because the situation in which you have a 6-year delay on a permitting or licensing a cable, it becomes quite intolerable in terms of actually being able to plan your investment readily for this or plan your capacity readily for this when you're looking at snags that are that unpredictable. There's a reason, for example, why private equity has not seen subsea cables as a giant gold mine, right? I mean, even though they're critical infrastructure and you absolutely need to have them, and they run trillions of dollars of financial transactions or critical spy communications and clear intel, people don't want to invest in it because it is incredibly uncertain to actually deploy, very expensive. You don't know if you're, I mean, I think Meta in one instance actually had to strand investment because they weren't able ultimately, after spending a significant amount of capital to build the cable, they actually had to strand the investment because they couldn't get the license to land in the United States in the end. So ultimately in the end, I think that where we can improve that is to have governments and the private sector actually be much more, I think, forthcoming with their business models, and then and perhaps more forthcoming with some of the information that drives some of these national security decisions. And I think that's the only way we can get more resilience.
Yeah, just to jump on that real quick, when you think about the point that you made, Milo, off of this alignment standpoint, sure, your customer base in competition, right, is commercial. So when that, I'm going to go where Alex started us, right? Like when you change that geopolitical condition, states behave differently, right? In militarized crisis, and they behave differently. And the big question is, does tech act differently in those two geopolitical conditions, right? When you were just purely an enabler for the state to prosecute crisis and war, it's just sort of presumptive. You're a company, you're going to line up behind and provide what you provide, right? That's not so clear right now, right? If you look at in the Russia-Ukraine conflict, Microsoft makes a judgment very early on that war to move Ukrainian government functions to the cloud. Starlink makes a decision to provide operational battle space support. Neither one of those two things were really prearranged, right? In terms of, hey, if we're in a war, you guys are going to go and do this for us, right? And so this question about alignment, maybe there's a market assessment rate. I'm not your biggest customer in competition, but I'm going to be your biggest. I'm going to need you the most in crisis and war. And what does that look like in terms of potential agreements, financing, and that type of stuff to get over a little bit of what you just said, Grace?
Just thinking of another point of alignment that seems to have surfaced over the past several years is also this implicit decision not to really use Chinese technology in these. While they're not officially banned, there does not appear to be a willingness to use untrusted technology, or specifically Chinese technology, in these kinds of hyperscaler networks. And that is not a mandate at this point. It is just that magical alignment.
Right.
Yeah, I would sort of double down there, and I do think we're starting to see a couple of cables that are planned at the moment that are specifically designed to avoid geopolitical hotspots like, the Red Sea, the South China Sea, and so on. And I completely agree with Grace's point that on the sort of untrusted vendors question, there is clearly those companies seem to have read the room, as it were, on it, and voluntarily come to the table without necessarily a mandate being in place. But I think about this more from a concern of legacy, right? There is a lot of work going forward, which is taking into account those things. But once a cable's laid, it's laid, right? And we can't upend the infrastructure which already sits in place. I do want to circle back to Paula's point earlier, though, which is that by far and away, if you were to look at the single best thing that we can do to insulate the ecosystem, the ability to move information from point to point wherever it has to go to get there, redundancy is so key, because it not only enables you to do that in a time of crisis, it disincentivizes the threat actor from doing anything. Because if cutting 10 cables isn't going to achieve anything, why cut 10 cables and have the sort of the downside risk? So I agree with everything that's been said along the panel. We are coming up against time, so I just want to do one more quick fire for the panel, if I could, which is policymakers are looking at this space at the moment. I get the sense, particularly in the international domain, they're starting to get increasingly agitated to do something. If you were to encourage policymakers to do or not do one thing over the coming year, what would it be?
Want me to go first? So I would ask policymakers to imagine a world in which the United States loses the strategic competition. So don't be complacent, right? We beat Nazi Germany, we beat the Soviet Union. There's no guarantee. It's just because you won those two Doesn't mean you win the next big strategic competition, right? And so whatever you're doing is starting from a standpoint that you have to actually take this pretty seriously, right? We have a geopolitical economic competitor, right? Which we didn't face in the last two, right? We faced geopolitical military competitors. But now we have a geopolitical military economic competitor. And I think that has to inform policymaking at a much more serious level than it has to date.
I think we have to face the fact that cables are likely going to get cut. And we need to think about what kind of deterrence is going to be available. That is to say, what deters a adversary from cutting commercial cables? And I just want to emphasize, right, the commercial nature of the traffic doesn't make it less vital than military traffic. If China wanted to do something in the South China Sea and blunt a U.S. response, the first thing they should do is take out FedEx and UPS and DHL, because then you're left with military air, and that is wholly inadequate for logistics movement these days. We don't have self-sufficiency in the military to move things. And so you've got commercial dependency on those systems, whether or not it's via fiber or the actual software and backend that schedules pilots, aircraft, et cetera. So we need to be thinking about how do we deter attacks on that infrastructure, and what happens if they happen?
Paula?
Sure, I'll jump in. I think I'll just revert to what I said previously, which is ensuring that we can deploy and repair at speed. At least, from a cloud provider's perspective, those are the kinds of things that we can have some control over. I think some of these larger geopolitical challenges are not challenges that will be solely solved by industry. I mean, I think Grace alluded to the notion of having sort of industry and governmental partnerships. I think folks also have to remember as well that when we do subsea cables, those cables land in another point, right? In a foreign point. So there's a lot of stuff that will need to be balanced just based on that reality. But having the ability to remove restrictions, limitations, and allow us to deploy at speed, recognizing that, part of the process is to work with the security agencies and put in place a security agreement. And we appreciate the importance of that. But moving with speed, I think for us is really important.
Grace, to round us out.
Yeah. I think actually everybody said everything already. I think what I heard, though, most clearly to me, it was the notion that economic security and national security are very intertwined, right? We are facing the same kind of we're facing an economic competition that is also very much a national security competition that we've never really sort of encountered before. And to that end, our dependencies on our commercial sector very much contribute to our national security. So being reliant on FedEx, being reliant on commercial telecommunications providers, all of that needs to be shored up. And one of the things that government absolutely has to do then is to ensure that they are allowing the commercial sector to run with all due haste, to expand, grow, innovate, and to provide those kinds of legal structures and frameworks to ensure that that's all possible. Including a mechanism for deterring, I think, the kind of malignant behavior that we're trying to deter when it comes to cybersecurity or to cable sabotage.
Alex, I got to give one last historical context for leaving everybody. I know we're up against it.
Far away.
The first time that we have recorded state cutting cables in war, 1898, William McKinley authorizing it against the Philippines, Cuba, and Puerto Rico to cut off the Spanish from their own empire. right? So in war, states do different things, right? And we shouldn't rely on economic deterrence, right? There has to be this broader strategic deterrence to do it.
I hope that's not too dark a note to leave off on. But
We're not fun at cocktail parties. That's the
thank you all so much for listening, and please join me in a round of applause for the panelists.